Hey guys, picture this. You're stumbling through a dark, primeval swamp that smells like scorched sandalwood and wet earth, and somewhere in the distance, a booming voice just announced, "Let there be something." Before we dive into the crazy, chaotic birth of the universe in Genesis, smash that like button if you love mythic drama, and drop a comment telling us your favorite creation story. Maybe it's the one where a cat knocks over a vase instead of a cosmic egg. Dim the lights, grab a coffee or a potion if you're feeling adventurous, and settle in, because we're about to get cozy with the ultimate origin tale that's part epic, part family feud, and a lot of divine paperwork. You'll feel the weight of a celestial ledger as Adam's first steps crunch on fresh molded mud. Hear the hiss of the serpent's tongue slithering through Eden's fragrant apple-laden breeze, and even taste the bittersweet sting of forbidden fruit on the back of your tongue. Think of it like scrolling through the oldest, most dramatic group chat ever, where God drops mic-dropping announcements, and everyone's constantly arguing about who stole the last piece of bread. So let's jump in. Ready to meet the original cast of characters who turned a blank page into a wild, messy saga that still haunts our headlines today. At the very start, the universe was a pitch-black void that smelled like stale incense and the quiet hum of nothingness. Then God shouted, "Let there be light," and a burst of white cracked the darkness like a stadium light flicking on, scorching the air with a fresh, electric snap. The heavens unfurled, sky blue and bruised at the edges, while the earth rose out of a swirling stew of water, mud, and the smell of wet stone. Stars popped into place with a pop-rock sound, and the world got its first soundtrack, the wind whispering through newly grown grass. Next came the garden party of creation. Land and sea split like a pizza dough, each topping with herbs that tickled the nose with rosemary and pine. From the dust, God molded a figure, shaping him with the care of a potter and the swagger of a director casting a lead. Human, made in the divine image, with eyes that could stare at a sunrise and laugh at a meme. He breathed life into the clay, and the first breath smelled like cool morning frost, rustling the leaves and sending a chorus of birds into a jittery chorus. Adam walked, feeling the gritty texture of soil under his feet, and God's smile echoed in the rustle of leaves, promising a partnership as tight as a buddy cop duo. But God wasn't just a creator. He was a contract maker, drafting a promise that would ripple through every chapter like a spoiler alert you can't ignore. He whispered to Adam, "You'll be the boss of this garden, but don't eat the fruit of the tree. Think of it as the ultimate no-cheat code." The air thickened with the sweet scent of forbidden apples, a temptation that would later inspire sitcom plots about the one that got away. Yet even as the serpent slithered, the covenant glimmered, a golden thread stitching humanity's messes into a grand saga that still hums in every bedtime story, every ancient scroll, and yes, even the occasional superhero origin. Morning light filtered through the emerald canopy of Eden, splashing the ground with honey gold shafts that made the dew on the leaves glisten like tiny mirrors. Adam brushed the soft bark of the tree of knowledge, feeling its rough skin under his fingertips, while Eve laughed at the buzzing of 1,000 birds rehearsing their sunrise aria. The serpent, slick as a polished marble statue, whispered a cheeky promise that the fruit would give them big brain vibes. As if an ancient TikTok challenge were at stake, temptation crackled like static, and together they snapped the crimson apple, its perfume a mingling of sweet perfume and bitter warning. In that instant, the garden's perfect chord struck a sour dissonance, and the world tilted on its axis. The moment the skin split, a sudden rush of heat scorched their cheeks, and a shiver of shame ran like cold water down their spines. Suddenly, the rustle of leaves turned into gossiping rustle, as if the trees were whispering, "Did you see that?" And the air thickened with the sour scent of regret and wet soil. God's voice thundered, but not with anger, more like a disappointed parent catching kids eating the last cookie, and he cast them out with a gentle but firm hand. The garden gates slammed shut, reverberating like a bass drop at a concert, leaving them to trudge through thorns that scratched like cheap denim. Their bare feet met the gritty ground, each step a reminder that paradise now felt as distant as a vintage meme. Exiled, Adam and Eve learned to wrestle with hunger, sweat, and the ever-present echo of that first bite, turning survival into a gritty, day-to-day saga worthy of any epic series. Their children grew up hearing the story at firesides, eyes wide as they imagined a world where fruit could download wisdom directly to the brain, a joke that would later become the legend of the promised apple. Yet amid the toil, a stubborn spark flickered, a whispered hope that one day the broken harmony could be mended, like a vinyl record scratched but still playable. This ember of redemption rode on the backs of their descendants, each generation stitching together fragments of grace like patchwork quilts. And so the shadow of the garden stretched long, but it also cast a light that beckoned the world toward a future where the original sin might finally be turned into a punchline for the ages. When the world turned into a noisy market of greed, murder, and flattery, the heavens grew heavy with a sour stench of corruption. Villagers shouted over each other's lies as if they were at a never-ending auction, and the soil tasted of blood. From the clouds God watched, his eyes narrowing like a judge on a cooking show. He declared enough and brewed a storm that would wash the canvas clean. The sky darkened, and the wind began to howl like a wounded beast. Noah, the lone sober soul amid the chaos, hammered timber with the determination of a DIY show host building a deck in a hurricane. He packed his ark with cedar planks, pitch, and enough rope to tie up a small army, while neighbors laughed as if he were opening a boutique pet store. When the first pair of elephants stamped in, the deck shuddered, and a chorus of croaks, bleats, and a mischievous monkey's chatter filled the air. Rain fell in sheets thicker than a Netflix binge-watch marathon, drumming the hull like tribal drums. By the time the waters rose, the ark floated like a colossal wooden ship of souls, humming with the scent of wet wood and animal musk. When the torrent finally retreated, the ark settled on a mountain that smelled of petrichor and fresh pine, and the survivors stepped onto a world that glistened like a freshly cleaned kitchen floor. Noah looked up as a bow of colors arced across the sky, the first natural Instagram filter ever created. God spoke, promising never again to dunk the earth in a watery wipeout, sealing the vow with a rainbow that smelled faintly of ozone. The people rejoiced, their feet muddy but their hearts light, and even the birds sang a tune that sounded suspiciously like an 80s power ballad. From that day on, every stormy cloud carried a whisper of this covenant, reminding all that hope can rise after the flood. In the thick, baked heat of Abraham heard the whisper of a mysterious summons, like an ancient ringtone echoing off sun-baked bricks. He packed a few oil jars, a handful of dates, and a ragged cloak, feeling the weight of his father's incense-laden market stalls fade behind him. The road unfurled as a dusty river, each step kicking up gritty clouds that smelled of dried figs and donkey sweat. With a hesitant grin, he imagined trading his familiar ziggurat for a place where the sky might actually be a new kind of roof. The sky, vast and indifferent, seemed to wink at him, promising a drama bigger than any city-state saga. Soon the desert turned relentless, a furnace of sand that cracked his throat and sang with the howls of roaming wolves. Abraham's caravan stumbled through a famine that made the camels grumble louder than a malfunctioning Wi-Fi router, and he had to barter his prized herd for a bowl of watery barley. One night, under a sky splattered with stars, he argued with his wife Sarah about whether a promise could be delivered without a Google Maps route. She rolled her eyes, but the desert silence answered with a soft, reassuring breeze. Trials piled on like endless levels in a video game, each obstacle testing his patience, his humor, and his faith in a God who seemed to hide in the shadows of the dunes. Yet every sunrise painted the dunes gold, reminding him that even the harshest sand can glitter when the light hits just right. Then, as if the heavens had finally logged in, a voice thundered over the campfire, promising descendants as countless as the sand grains beneath his feet. Abraham stared at the endless expanse, feeling the wind wrap around his shoulders like a royal cloak, and laughed. "I'll need a bigger family tree, maybe a spreadsheet," while tears of awe mixed with the dust on his cheeks. The covenant sealed itself with a smoky aroma of burnt offerings, a scent that lingered like incense in a cathedral, binding him to a future nation that would echo his name across ages. Every step he took after that felt anchored, each footfall a beat in a story that would become the backbone of Genesis, a narrative as sturdy as a stone altar, yet as alive as the desert's heartbeat. And so, with the stars as witnesses, Abraham's journey became the first chapter of a saga that still whispers through the ages, reminding us that bold beginnings often sprout from the most unsettling goodbyes. The sun beat down on the dusty hills of Canaan as Jacob shuffled his ragged flock, eyes flickering to the restless faces of his 12 boys. Their quarrels crackled like dry brush, Cain and Abel long gone, now Esau's heirs squabbling over birthright jokes that felt more like a sitcom punchline. Jacob's crafty smile hid a secret plan, a subtle shuffle of blessings that would sow the seeds of 12 distinct tribes, each with its own banner and stubborn temperament. When the eldest, Reuben, tried to wrestle the future away, a cold wind rattled the tents, reminding everyone that destiny was not a game of dice, but a divine contract etched in the very soil. The boys laughed and cursed, their voices echoing off the stone walls, unaware they were rehearsing the anthem of a nation. Half a generation later, Joseph, draped in a coat that shimmered like a runway dress, strutted into the courtyard of Pharaoh's palace, his swagger turning heads and raising eyebrows among the stone-cold officials. The brothers' betrayal felt like a badly dubbed thriller, sold into slavery, the scent of sweat and sand clinging to his skin as he toiled for Potiphar, only to be framed by a seductive accusation that sent him spiraling into a dank prison where the air tasted of mildew and hopelessness. Behind those iron bars, Joseph befriended a baker whose stale loaves floated on a breeze of foretelling, and an ancient cupbearer whose wine-stained lips whispered dreams of flying mice and sun-crowned heads. When Pharaoh's nightmares arrived, 7 lean cows devouring 7 fat ones, Joseph's knack for interpretation turned a night terror into a national plan, and he rose like a celebrity chef in a reality show, feeding an empire with grain while the Nile's floodwaters hissed and roared. The whole nation cheered, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the hot desert wind, as Joseph's strategic stockpiles turned famine into a banquet for his own kin. Years later, the famished Israelites trudged across the arid plains, their feet blistered, their bellies empty, guided by a dream-filled elder who promised that the promise to Abraham would not dissolve like sand through fingers. As they crossed the Nile's silt, the water slapped their boots, and the scent of papyrus mingled with the metallic tang of Pharaoh's chariots. A quiet irony whispered, the very empire that saved them now plotted to enslave them. Yet Jacob's whispered blessing echoed through the camps, each tribe's banner snapping in the wind like a drumbeat announcing the coming exodus. A story so epic it could outshine any modern blockbuster. The people gathered around firelight, their faces illuminated by flickering flames, feeling a mix of dread and hope as divine providence stitched their scattered threads into one resilient tapestry. And so, under a sky bruised with twilight, the stage was set for a grand departure, an adventure where miracles would dance with Moses' staff, and the ancient promise would finally take its full, thunderous breath. The sun unfurled like a golden scroll, spilling amber over a sea of dew-kissed grass. Adam rose from the soft humus, feeling the cool bite of earth on his bare feet as birds stitched melodies into the morning. Every tree stood in perfect symmetry, its bark warm and fragrant, while blossoms exhaled a perfume that tasted of ripe figs and fresh rain. A gentle wind rustled the leaves, whispering clues about the rhythm of seasons, and even the squirrels seemed to practice synchronized acrobatics. In that untouched theater, the world hummed with a promise that every breath would be a celebration of abundance. Eve drifted into the clearing, her laughter ringing like crystal chimes against the backdrop of a babbling brook. Together, they learned to coax water from crystal springs, to tend vines that curled like emerald serpents, and to harvest fruits that burst with juice louder than a pop song chorus. One evening, the divine voice draped over the garden like silk, delivering a single, solemn command: love this place and never bite the fruit of the lone silvery tree. The warning hung in the air, a crisp scent of incense mixed with a hint of iron, as if the garden itself held its breath. They nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on their shoulders like a freshly forged crown. Days slipped by, and curiosity sprouted like a weed, stubborn and bright, especially when a sly serpent in a glossy tuxedo swaggered by with a wink. He offered the forbidden fruit, its skin glossy as a Hollywood red carpet, promising taste the knowledge that TikTok influencers binge on. Eve hesitated, eyes flickering between awe and the echo of that divine warning, while Adam cheered her on as if at a sports arena. The bite was a thunderclap of sweetness and regret, the juice staining their lips with the first hint of shame, and the garden shivered as if the ground had cracked. Yet even as shadows crept, the garden's dawn still whispered, reminding them that every fall plants the seed of a future rise. The serpent slid into the garden like a velvet-coated conspirator, its scales glittering beneath the amber sunrise. A faint rustle of leaves whispered in its wake, mingling with the sweet perfume of ripening figs and the earthy musk of damp soil. It coiled around the ancient fig tree, eyes flickering with a mischievous spark that reminded one of a Netflix villain who just discovered a cheat code. With a silky hiss, it slipped a slender tongue of doubt into Eve's ear, planting a question that tasted like forbidden chocolate. The garden held its breath, the birds pausing mid-song as the serpent's promise of hidden knowledge curled like smoke around the blossoms. Eve clutched the cool bark, her heart thudding like a drumline at a halftime show, while the serpent's words danced atop the breeze. She imagined the fruit as a glowing apple. No, not the tech kind, but a crunchy, mind-expanding bite that could turn her into the ultimate know-it-all. The scent of the fruit swelled, sweet and sharp, tugging at her curiosity like a child reaching for the last slice of pizza. Yet a quiet voice, like an old-school teacher scolding a mischievous pup, reminded her of the single rule etched in stone: obey or endure the fallout. She hovered between temptation and loyalty, the internal tug of war sounding like an over-caffeinated sitcom laugh track. Adam stood a few steps away, his fingers brushing the rough stone of the garden wall, feeling the tremor of Eve's indecision ripple through the air. He watched the serpent's sinewy form dissolve into the shadows, its hiss echoing like a bad ringtone that won't stop. A knot of dread coiled in his gut, as palpable as the morning dew that clung to his bare feet, warning that something irreversible was about to snap. When Eve finally reached for the glossy fruit, the world seemed to hold its breath. The birds resumed their song, but a subtle crack reverberated through the leaves, an audible gasp from creation itself. In that split second, the garden's innocence slipped away, leaving behind the smoky aftertaste of regret and the faint, ironic chuckle of a serpent who just won the ultimate gotcha moment. The serpent slithered like a slicked-back hair due from a 70s disco, eyes gleaming with the promise of forbidden Wi-Fi. It whispered to Eve that a single bite would hand her the cheat codes of the universe, and the garden's air smelled of ripe mango and mischief. Eve's palm trembled as she brushed the glossy skin of the fruit, feeling the weight of 1,000 unanswered text messages. With a grin that could rival a cat meme, she plucked the fruit, its skin pulsing like a neon sign. She turned to Adam, eyes bright with conspiratorial thrill, and offered him the first download of humanity. Adam took the fruit, and the moment the sweet flesh touched his tongue, a burst of sugar and static crackled like an over-caffeinated dragon. Their eyes popped open, not with enlightenment but with the raw glare of embarrassment, as if they'd just been caught skipping class. A shiver rippled through the garden, the roses wilted a fraction, the river hiccuped, and a distant owl let out a sigh that sounded like a judge's gavel. The once pristine foliage seemed to laugh, leaf to leaf, at the pair's clumsy rebellion, while a faint perfume of burnt incense rose from the soil. In that instant, innocence cracked like an old vinyl record, the groove of perfection forever scratched. God's voice rolled in like a thunderous bass drop, but instead of a remix, it was a solemn sermon about responsibility and broken promises. Adam and Eve stood, cheeks flushed, clutching the now spotted fruit as if it were a souvenir from a bad concert. The garden's gates creaked open, ushering in a chilly wind that smelled of pine needles and overdue chores. As they shuffled out, the serpent winked, already drafting a sequel titled The Apple of Marketing. Their stumble became the first footnote in every cautionary tale, reminding us that the cheapest shortcuts often cost us the most spectacularly. The Almighty stepped into the glade like a judge at a courtroom, voice thundering over the rustle of newly awakened leaves. He pointed a finger at Adam and Eve, declaring a sorrowful sentence that peeled away the garden's emerald shield. The once soft grass turned to coarse sand under their feet, and the fragrant air turned sharp with the scent of impending toil. Their eyes widened as the golden gate creaked open, a creaking that sounded suspiciously like a squeaky office door in a sitcom. Even the cherubs in the canopy seemed to sigh, their laughter muted by the weight of divine bureaucracy. With heavy hearts, they crossed the threshold, the gate slamming shut behind them like a thundering bass drum at a rock concert. The world beyond was a patchwork of thorny scrub and dust-choked wind that slapped their faces and whispered, "Welcome to reality." Their hands, once clean, now clutched the rough bark of a gnarled tree, feeling every splinter like a reminder of their choice. The earth trembled under their steps, each tread sinking into mud that smelled of iron and regret. Yet, high above the canopy, a faint star flickered, the promise of redemption, as distant as a Netflix binge after a long workday. They trudged forward, a procession of misfit heroes, stumbling over unseen roots like a clumsy dancer on a stage of chaos. Every night, the sky draped itself in bruised purples, and the wind sang a mournful lullaby that made even the hardest stone weep. Yet in the quiet moments, they heard a soft chuckle in the rustling leaves, as if the garden itself was winking, reminding them that irony never dies. Mistakes become myths. Their scarred skins glistened with sweat and soil, each drop a badge of survival, each breath a stubborn defiance of the curse. And as they looked back once, they saw the gate's silhouette shimmer, a reminder that the story isn't over. It's just waiting for the sequel. When the gate clanged shut behind them, Adam and Eve stepped onto soil that smelled of raw earth and rusted iron. The sun hammered their backs, turning the freshly sprouted grass into a carpet of sweat-slick blades. They lifted a stubborn seed, felt the gritty husk crumble between their fingers, and the world hummed with the low growl of distant wildlife. Every crack in the ground echoed like a badly timed Wi-Fi drop, reminding them that nothing would be handed to them on a silver platter. Yet the horizon glowed with a promise, a soft orange that whispered, "Game on, folks." Together they fashioned a modest shelter, its thatch rattling like a toddler's drum set when the wind teased it. Eve's laugh bounced off the walls, a bright note that cut through the relentless chirp of insects, while Adam cracked jokes about their new home improvement project, comparing it to assembling flat-pack furniture without an instruction manual. They learned that love meant sharing the heat of a fire that smelled of pine resin and burnt marshmallows, even when the flames sputtered like a diva's bad karaoke night. Responsibility settled on their shoulders like a heavy cloak, reminding them that each seed they sowed demanded patience, sweat, and occasional muttering about how just one more day felt like an eternity. In that gritty crucible, hope sprouted like a stubborn dandelion pushing through concrete, stubborn enough to make even the angels upstairs raise an eyebrow. The first harvest arrived crooked, bruised, and tasting like a misprogrammed video game glitch. But they chewed it anyway, feeling the bitter grit scrape their tongues. Their hands, blistered and raw, learned the language of endurance, each scar a tattoo of perseverance that would make even a superhero's origin story blush. When Adam slipped in the mud, sending a splash of earth onto Eve's new dress, they burst into laughter, realizing that compassion is often just a muddy hand offered in the dark. They whispered promises of a future garden, a redemption so bright it would outshine any Netflix binge-watch climax, where the soil would once again cradle perfect fruit. Thus, their brokenness became the fertile ground for a hope that refuses to wilt, planting the seed of restoration that still whispers through the ages. The sun beat down on a land drenched in blood and ash, where every village sounded like a non-stop drum solo of swords clashing. Out of that chaos, a voice as clear as a mountain spring cut through the haze, and there stood the Almighty, eyes like polished amber, staring at a lone farmer named Noah. God leaned on a cloud and said, "Build me a massive boat, 3 decks high, and I'll save you and a handful of critters from the flood I'm about to unleash." Noah felt his heart thump like a war drum, his palms slick with sweat and the smell of fresh pine needles drifting from the nearby forest. He glanced at his family, whose murmurs were a mix of awe and the kind of nervous chuckle that says, "What? You want us to start a DIY project in the middle of apocalypse?" Noah rolled up his sleeves, and the construction began with a chorus of hammer blows that echoed like a blacksmith's karaoke night. He measured the timbers with a carpenter's eye, recalling the old story of the ark's blueprint like a Pinterest board of impossible dimensions. The wood creaked under his fingers, rough as a grizzled veteran's beard, while the scent of sap and cut oak filled the air, masking the distant cries of starving wolves. Neighbors sneered, tossing jokes that the ark would be the world's first floating parking garage, but Noah's resolve was as steady as a GPS on a road trip to the promised land. Even the goats seemed to sense the irony, bleating a chorus that sounded suspiciously like a medieval marching band as they helped haul the massive beams. As the final plank snapped into place, thunder rolled like a giant bass drum, announcing the covenant sealed with a flash of divine fire. God's promise floated on the wind, a whisper of salvation that tasted sweet like rain on parched soil, and the whole family felt a surge of awe mixed with the nervous jitter of a pre-concert audience. Animals arrived in a chaotic parade, pairs of lions swaggering like movie stars, ducks quacking in perfect rhythm, and a bewildered camel humming a low-key beat that could rival any hip-hop bass line. The ark's interior smelled of fresh pine, wet canvas, and the faint metallic tang of anticipation, while the sky darkened, hinting that the world was about to get a very overdue bath. Noah stood on the deck, grinning like a host of a reality show about survival, and declared, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the biggest houseboat ever built. No refunds, but the view's priceless." Noah swung his axe like a rock star riff, splintering cedar logs that sang with the whine of cutting edges. His wife, eyes sharp as a hawk, handed him fresh ropes while their teenage sons cracked jokes about building the world's biggest doghouse. Neighbors gathered on the hill, tossing sneers that smelled of cheap wine and idle gossip, calling the project a Noah flick sequel that would never see a premiere. Yet the hammer's thud echoed louder than the jeers, and the scent of sap and sweat wrapped the crew in a gritty perfume of purpose. When the first animal pair clattered onto the deck, a bewildered goat sneezed, scattering pine needles like confetti at a wedding. Noah's voice rose over the pandemonium, directing lions, lambs, and a bewildered parrot that kept quoting, "Polly wants a miracle," as they were shepherded into cramped crates. The heat rose, the sun baked the timber, and the smell of sweat and animal musk fused into a choking stew that would make a desert caravan wince. Every night, the family counted the mismatched socks of fur and feather, laughing that the ark was turning into a floating zoo mall, while a distant storm rumbled like a bass drop. In the hush before the first drop, Noah knelt on the uneven floorboards, feeling the splintered wood bite his knees. Yet his heart thumped with a steady drumbeat of trust. He whispered the covenant to the wind, and the gale answered with a gentle sigh that smelled of rain-soaked earth, promising that the flood would wash away the mockers. The family gathered, sharing stale bread that crumbled like old parchment, and swore an oath louder than the thunder, their laughter echoing against the hull's curved belly. As the clouds gathered, the ark creaked under the weight of hope, and even the cynical village kids peered over the fence, realizing that faith sometimes builds more than wood. It builds a story worth telling forever. Soon the rain would start, and the world would remember this wooden ship as the ultimate proof that patience can outlast any Instagram trend. The sky turned a bruised violet as the last plank of the massive timber vessel slipped into place, and the townsfolk, who'd been snickering at Noah's big boat, like it was a reality TV challenge, suddenly fell silent. A gust of cold wind rattled the unfinished roof, scattering loose straw like confetti at a failed parade. Children who'd once tossed pebbles at the growing hull now clutched their mother's skirts, eyes wide as if the heavens were about to drop a literal mic drop. In the distance, the chorus of jeering merchants faded, replaced by a low, ominous rumble that sounded suspiciously like a disgruntled dragon snoozing under a mountain. The scent of wet earth rose through the air, promising rain, but also the smell of burnt wood from their own scornful bonfires. Noah, now dressed in a coat that had seen more seasons than a sitcom rerun, marched the animals aboard with the solemnity of a line director on a movie set. He coaxed a reluctant llama past a nervous flock of doves, whispering, "You're not auditioning for a Disney sequel, just a long voyage." The elephants stomped like thunder drums, the wolves growled a low baritone, and a bewildered goat tried to climb the rail, only to be shooed back with a gentle but firm, "No, you're not the mascot for Goat at the Gate." The scent of fresh hay, wet fur, and a hint of goat cheese mingled, creating a perfume that could make even a desert nomad pause. Laughter, though rare, bubbled from Noah when a mischievous monkey slipped on a banana peel left by a careless carpenter, reminding everyone that even in divine drama, slapstick still finds a stage. When the first fat drop thudded against the nailed planks, Noah's calloused hands slammed the massive doors shut with a clang that echoed like a gong at a medieval festival. The rain fell in sheets, each one a cold needle stitching the world together in a wet, metallic tapestry, while the ground below turned into a bubbling stew of mud and broken pottery. Inside the ark, the scent of pine and animal musk blended with the crisp, metallic tang of impending doom, making the air feel like a backstage dressing room before a disaster movie climax. Noah stood at the threshold, his beard dripping, and chuckled. Well, folks, it's officially Noah's Ark, the ultimate survival reality. As the floodwaters surged, swallowing the scornful city like a giant, unforgiving bathtub, the ark rocked gently, cradling hope in its timber heart. The heavens cracked open, pouring a relentless deluge that turned the world into a roiling sea of gray. For 40 days and nights, the wind howled like a legion of angry drummers, slamming the ark's wooden hull with fists of foaming water. Inside, the deck swayed under a thunderous symphony of splintering wood and the distant roar of drowned cities. Even the gulls that had fled before the storm seemed to line up on the clouds, watching the ark like a reality show set, eager for the drama. All the while the rain hammered the roof with a rhythm that could wake the dead, and the scent of wet cedar and brine filled every breath. Noah's family huddled in the cramped belly of the vessel, shoulders brushing like sardines in a can of fermented fish. The pantry, once stocked with barrels of grain and jars of honey, now clanged emptily as the last loaves crumbled to dust. Eli, the youngest, whispered jokes about post-apocalypse pizza delivery that fell flat against the sour tang of stale bread. Their sleep was punctuated by the creak of timbers and the occasional sneeze of a goat that smelled like damp laundry detergent. Yet every laugh, every groan, and every shared slice of dried fig stitched a tighter bond, a reminder that obedience was not just a command, but a family game of keep the fire alive. As the storm raged, the weight of the covenant pressed on Noah's shoulders like a stone tablet carved with ancient law. He stared at the dripping ceiling, seeing in each droplet the promise that the flood would end, and a rainbow would arc across the bruised sky. The animals, restless and snorting, seemed to mock the humans, their eyes glinting with a mix of survival instinct and mischievous curiosity. When the wind finally sighed and the waters began to recede, a faint glimmer of sunrise painted the hull in gold, and the crew felt the first sigh of relief. With mud-caked boots and wet hair, they stepped onto the soggy earth, laughing at the irony that they'd survived a cosmic bathtub test, ready to write the next chapter of humanity under a newly minted rainbow. As the last roar of the deluge faded, the hulking ark groaned to a halt on the summit of a jagged mountain, its wooden ribs soaking in the sun-baked mist. The air smelled of brine, pine sap, and the iron tang of blood-streaked sand that clung to the deck. Noah, whose beard was now a tangled reef of algae, stared down at a landscape that looked like God's Instagram filter set to post-apocalypse. Around him, the surviving creatures shuffled, half asleep, half confused, as if they'd just emerged from the world's longest wet nap. Even the sky seemed to sigh, pulling back its heavy gray blanket to reveal a tentative, bruised blue. Grateful and a bit greedy, Noah hauled a trembling ram to the bow and burned it, sending a plume of smoky incense spiraling up like a heavenly fog machine. The scent of charred meat mingled with the crisp mountain air, tickling the nostrils of the gathered family and the curious goats that nibbled at the soot-blackened grass. From the heavens a voice boomed, smoother than a vinyl record, promising never again to flood the earth, and then, like a divine Snapchat filter, a brilliant rainbow arced across the sky. Its colors stretched from violet to scarlet, each hue dripping like freshly spilled paint, a visual warranty stamped in the clouds for all eternity. Noah laughed, half in awe, half in disbelief, thinking that even the Almighty had a flair for dramatic graphics. With the covenant stitched across the heavens, the survivors stepped onto the fresh earth, feeling the cool, crumbly soil between their toes like powdered sugar on a fresh donut. Birds sang a chorus that sounded suspiciously like a rebooted playlist, while the wind carried whispers of new growth. saplings pushing through the damp ground, green as a video game health bar. The scent of pine and wet moss filled the lungs, and even the oldest cynic among them felt a spark of hope, as if someone had pressed the universe's reset button. Children giggled, chasing each other around the ark's rust-stained timbers, their laughter echoing off the cliffs like a soundtrack to a sequel nobody saw coming. In that moment, the world felt both raw and refined, a gritty masterpiece awaiting the next chapter of humanity's bold, sometimes clumsy, walk with the divine. On a scorching dawn in the city hummed like a beehive, its mud brick walls echoing the cries of merchants hawking barley and the clatter of copper bracelets. The air tasted of baked dates, and the sharp tang of incense wafting from a temple courtyard where Abram stood, his beard dusted with sun-burnt sand. Suddenly, a voice thundered from the heavens, promising a mountain of descendants and a land where the wheat would sway like golden hair. Abram's heart hammered louder than the nearby blacksmith's hammer, and his eyes flickered like a candle in a sandstorm. He swallowed the fear, feeling the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The promise sounded as wild as a streaming service, announcing a new series where the hero must abandon his Netflix binge for a desert trek with zero Wi-Fi. Abram paced the narrow alleys, the rough stone under his sandals scraping his soles, while his mind replayed the divine offer like an echo in a canyon. He imagined his family's stubborn goats demanding fresh pasture, the smell of fresh-cut wool, and the sound of his wife's laughter turning into a sigh of resignation. Doubt gnawed at him like a desert fox, yet each skeptical thought sparked a stubborn grin. After all, who else could brag about a covenant that included literal stars as descendants? With a firm nod to the sky, he whispered a reluctant yes, letting irony slip out like a chuckle in the wind. The covenant sealed itself with a blaze of fire that crackled against the night, the scent of ozone mixing with the distant aroma of roasted lamb from a nearby feast. Abram felt the promise pulse through his veins, as vivid as the heat of the sun scorching the back of his neck, and he lifted his staff, feeling the woods grain under his calloused fingers. Around him, the city's clamor faded, replaced by the solemn silence of a promise that would stitch together nations, generations, and stories, whispered around campfires for centuries. He stepped onto the dusty road, his cloak ripping with each stride, his doubts now tiny crumbs kicked aside by the steady rhythm of his boots. The journey began, and the world would forever remember the day a humble man answered a celestial text message with unwavering obedience. Under a sky peppered with 1,000 glittering stars, Abram hefted his pack and nudged his donkey toward the dusty trail that led out of His wife Sarai, swaddled in a shawl that smelled faintly of cumin and oil, followed close, clutching a basket of dates like a portable energy bar. Lot, ever the opportunist, chattered about the great unknown as if it were a new streaming series, while the caravan's camels muttered complaints about the sand. The city's walls receded behind them, their flickering torchlight looking like a lonely Instagram filter over an ancient postcard. Every step felt like a silent prayer, a trust in a promise whispered by God under the same constellations. By dawn, the desert's breath turned hot, and the sand hissed like a low fuel engine under their feet. The donkey's hooves kicked up clouds of grit that stung their eyes, while the scent of roasted lamb mingled with the acrid tang of sweat. Lot tried to lighten the mood, claiming the heat was just nature's sauna. But even his jokes crumbled like brittle pottery when a gust of wind tossed a tumbleweed into the path. Abram's voice rose over the clamor, urging the group forward, his hands gripping the rope of his tent as if it were a lifeline. Night fell again, and the chorus of nocturnal insects sounded like a primitive soundtrack to their relentless march. Yet amid the grit and fatigue, Abram clung to the promise that God had spoken, a promise brighter than any city's neon sign. He imagined a future where their descendants would claim the promised land, and that thought sparked a grin so wide Sarai teased that he must have been chewing on a piece of divine gum. The caravan's pace slowed, but their spirits rose, each footfall echoing a heartbeat of faith. When the stars reappeared, they seemed to wink, as if the heavens themselves approved of this stubborn trek into the unknown. In that moment, the hardship tasted sweet, like the first sip of cold water after a desert binge, and Abraham's trust cemented itself for the road ahead. The caravan trudged through a sun-bleached wasteland, the sand hot as a griddle and the sky an unrelenting sheet of blue. Grain stores ran low, and the men whispered about famine like a gossip column about the latest celebrity scandal. Off in the distance, the banners of rival kings fluttered like angry flags at a backyard barbecue, promising raids if the desert winds turned sour. Inside the moving tent, tension crackled louder than the campfire, as families squabbled over the dwindling water skins. Yet Abram stood at the edge, eyes fixed on the horizon, his faith humming louder than the desert's howl. When Abram's nephew Lot set up camp too close for comfort, the two cousins faced a classic sibling showdown, except the prize was fertile pasture, not a video game controller. Abram, ever the diplomat, proposed a peaceful split, saying, "Let's not turn this desert into a soap opera with swords." Lot, with a grin that hinted at a secret stash of dates, agreed, and they marked the border with a single, sturdy palm tree. That night, a fresh well erupted from the cracked earth, bubbling like a soda fountain, and Abram laughed, noting that even the desert liked a good plot twist. He thanked the Almighty, tasting the sweet water on his lips, while the rest of the caravan cheered like a stadium crowd after a last-minute goal. Just when the dust settled, a messenger, no, a voice that sounded like a gentle desert breeze, declared that Abram's old bones would bear a child, as unlikely as a camel doing the moonwalk. Abram, whose hair resembled a tumbleweed, chuckled nervously, wondering if the promise came with a warranty. Yet the promise glowed brighter than the campfire's embers, warming his heart against the night's chill. He tucked his hand into Sarah's, feeling the roughness of her woven shawl, and whispered, "Even in our twilight, we're not done writing our story." The desert, indifferent yet oddly supportive, seemed to sigh, letting the stars spill over like a glittering audience awaiting the next act. One scorching afternoon, the voice of the Almighty cracked like thunder across the desert, demanding that Abram take his beloved son Isaac up the hill of Moriah and lay him on the altar as a burnt offering. Abram's heart hammered like a war drum, his palms slick with sweat as the scent of cumin and wild thyme drifted from the campfires. He stared at Isaac, whose youthful grin still clung to the memory of a recent spring festival, and felt the weight of a promise that suddenly tasted like ash. The command felt as absurd as asking a dad to barter his Wi-Fi router for a sacrificial goat. Yet Abram swallowed his dread and set out, his cloak rustling like a nervous audience. Every step pulsed with a mix of reverence, terror, and a stubborn hope that God would not leave the script unfinished. The trek up the rugged ridge turned into a marathon of stone-studded doubts. Each jagged rock slapped Abram's boots, echoing the thud of his uneasy conscience. He gathered the wood, his hands rough as sandpaper, while Isaac helped, oblivious, humming a tune that reminded Abram of lullabies his mother sang, ironic comfort in a grim tableau. As the sun bled orange across the sky, a cold wind whispered, "Are you sure?" And Abram answered with a clenched jaw, the fire in his chest flickering like the ember he was about to throw. The altar rose before them, a crude stone slab that smelled of dust and destiny, and Abram raised the knife, the blade glinting like a neon sign for suspense. Just as the knife found its murderous arc, a luminous figure swooped down, an angel with a voice softer than desert sand but louder than a stadium cheer, shouting, "Whoa, hold that steel!" The sudden shout jolted Abram, and his shoulders sagged in relief as a sturdy ram, smelling faintly of pine and triumph, sprang from the thicket, its horns locked in a triumphant pose. Abram lowered the knife, the blade slipping from his grip like a dropped controller, and wrapped the ram in his cloak, the animal's coarse wool scratching his cheek. Laughter rose from the heavens, a divine chuckle that made the desert birds pause mid-song, confirming that the promise was still alive and well. No more kid swapping needed. With Isaac's safety secured, Abram stared at the horizon, his faith now cemented like a rock-hard tablet, ready for the next chapter of miracles. When Isaac first stood tall enough to braid his own hair, the sun beat down on the rolling hills of Canaan, turning the wheat into a golden sea. He married Rebekah under a canopy of almond blossoms that scented the air like a promise of sweetness, while the distant clamor of sheep hooves kept time like a primitive drumbeat. Their tent smelled of fresh milk and leather, a comforting mix that reminded the old patriarch Abram of his own nights under star-splattered skies. They laughed at the absurdity of arranging a dowry in goat skins, a barter that felt more like a reality TV swap meet than a sacred covenant. Yet beneath the humor, a steady flame of faith glowed, for each sunrise stitched another thread into the tapestry of God's unbroken promise. Jacob, the younger twin, sprang from his mother's womb gripping his brother's heel like a mischievous kitten, foreshadowing the crafty hustle that would define his life. He grew up chasing after his flock, feeling the rough wool of the sheep and the sting of sunrise on his skin as he plotted his future with the cunning of a chess grandmaster. When he bargained for the birthright with a bowl of stew, the scent of garlic and cumin filled the tent, and Esau's laughter echoed like a sitcom laugh track, mocking the deal. Later, he disguised himself in his brother's goat skins, the smell of musk and sweat masking his identity as he slipped past Isaac's frail eyes, a scene straight out of a low-budget spy movie. Each twist in his story added a layer of grit, the gritty dust of the desert clinging to his boots, as he forged a destiny that would stretch from the Euphrates to the edge of the promised hill. When Jacob's 12 sons settled into the fertile valleys, the land sang with the rustle of olive trees and the distant clatter of pottery, a soundtrack to the fulfillment of a covenant older than the hills themselves. The patriarch's name, Abram, lingered in the whispers of the wind, a reminder that a single faith-filled step could echo through generations like a viral meme. Even the desert foxes seemed to pause, their amber eyes reflecting the flickering campfires where elders recounted the saga over spiced figs and bitter wine. In that moment, the promised land was no longer a distant dream but a palpable, sun-baked reality, and the people, scruffy, stubborn, grateful, stood shoulder to shoulder, grateful for a promise that survived famine, betrayal, and the occasional divine Wi-Fi outage. Thus Abraham's legacy endured, a testament that unwavering trust can turn a whisper from the heavens into a roaring, dust-filled parade of nations. In the sun-scarred fields of Canaan, Joseph, Jacob's favored son, strutted around like a teenage influencer with a crown of multicolored wool. He spun a tale of 2 dreams, a sheaf of wheat bowing before his, and a sunburst of brothers kneeling to his star-shaped coat. That made his brothers' stomachs churn like sour wine. Their envy boiled over as they imagined him as the next pharaoh, while Jacob watched, half amused, half worried, the scent of incense mixing with the dust. With a laugh that sounded like a cracked record, Joseph bragged, "One day I'll be the boss of all of you," a line that would soon echo as a meme in the family chat of ancient times. One night, the brothers lured Joseph into a narrow ravine, the air thick with the smell of goats, and tossed him into a pit that felt like a wet cellar. A passing caravan of Ishmaelite traders smelled opportunity, literally the greasy scent of camels and spices, and bought the bewildered dreamer for silver, loading him onto sand-blasted crates bound for Egypt. There, Pharaoh's palace dazzled with golden light, but a jealous overseer, drunk on power and onions, framed Joseph for a crime as flimsy as a paper scroll, landing him in a dank cell where the walls dripped with mildew. The iron bars clanged like a broken drumbeat, yet Joseph's coat still glimmered beneath the torchlight, a reminder that even chains can't mute a dreamer's swagger. While the night grew colder, Joseph stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the wheat and the sun, each image burning brighter than the flickering torches. He whispered to the rats, his new audience, "Watch this, I'll rise like a phoenix from a sandstorm," and the rats barely stirred, as if they were the ancient equivalent of silent TikTok viewers. The scent of fresh figs from the governor's kitchen wafted in, teasing his hunger and hinting at a destiny beyond prison walls. In that cramped cell, the dreamer's laughter echoed through the stone, a promise that Providence would turn his shackles into a throne, and the once mocked coat would someday drape a king's shoulders. The stone walls of the Egyptian jail smelled of damp sand and rust, and Joseph paced his narrow cell like a restless cat on a hot rooftop. Prison guards clanged their keys like percussionists, the echo bouncing off the low ceiling and stirring a chorus of rattling chains. In the dim torchlight, Joseph's eyes glimmered with a calm that made the other inmates whisper that he must have a secret hotline to the gods. He spent his evenings listening to the droning chatter of the courtyard, absorbing every rumor like a sponge soaked in papyrus ink. Even the rats seemed to shuffle away when he smiled, as if they sensed a new chapter about to unfold. One night the cupbearer, draped in faded linen, shuffled into the cell clutching a dream that felt as tangled as a knotted rope. He described 3 strange vines sprouting from his chest, each bearing ripe, juicy grapes that burst into wine when he tasted them. Joseph laughed half-heartedly. "Sounds like a vintage Instagram post, live, love, drink." Then, with a steady voice, decoded the symbols. The vines meant the king would lift him back to his former rank, the grapes a promise of restored favor. The cupbearer's eyes widened, and he whispered a vow to remember Joseph's name when the palace doors swung open again. The baker came next, half asleep, muttering about 3 baskets of bread stacked on his head, each baked loaf turning into ash and flies. Joseph's grin grew wry. He imagined the baker's nightmare as a bad episode of a cooking reality show gone spectacularly wrong. He explained that the 3 baskets foretold 3 days of the baker's life, one for the feast, one for the hangover, and one for the gallows, while the flies were the court's buzzing gossip. The baker shivered, pleading for a plea bargain, and Joseph, ever the pragmatist, urged him to beg the pharaoh for mercy. Though the baker's fate soon turned to ash, Joseph secured a solemn promise from the cupbearer. When the king's palate called for wine again, the dreamer would set Joseph free, even as the political winds outside the prison walls shifted like sandstorms on the Nile. The night air in the palace swirled with incense and the uneasy sighs of servants as Pharaoh tossed on his golden couch. In his slumber, he dreamed of a river of wheat that rose like a buttery tide, only to watch it recede into a barren desert of cracked, hungry stalks. The vision tasted sweet and then sour, the scent of freshly baked flatbread turning into the acrid whiff of dust. He awoke, heart thudding like a drum solo in a stadium, and demanded that his magicians and wise men decode the cryptic snack and starve tableau. Even the palace cats paused, ears twitching, as the king's frustration turned the chamber into a silent, tense replay of Game of Thrones without the dragons. The old cupbearer, whose memory had been on a 2-year-old wine cork schedule, remembered a Hebrew slave who could read dreams like subtitles on a movie screen. He whispered, "There's a lad, Joseph, who once turned my fate around faster than a TikTok trend," recalling the moment Joseph interpreted his own dream. The servants chuckled, half amused, half nervous, as the cupbearer scraped the dusty stone floor to find a reed pen and a small tablet of scribbles. He sent a swift runner, clad in linen, hair wild from the desert wind, to fetch Joseph, promising a royal audience that smelled faintly of spiced dates and sandalwood. The palace guards, accustomed to marching like a parade of ants, smirked at the notion that a shepherd boy could outwit a king. Yet excitement crackled in the air like static before a storm. When Joseph entered the throne room, his eyes gleamed with the confidence of someone who just solved a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. He bowed, felt the cool marble beneath his bare feet, and then, with a voice as steady as the Nile's flow, unraveled the paradox. 7 years of overflowing bounty, followed by 7 years of gnawing famine. The pharaoh's jaw dropped, his jeweled cuffs clinking like coins in a piggy bank, as Joseph outlined a grain store strategy that sounded like a massive, ancient version of the Great British Bake Off. He suggested filling reservoirs of silos with golden barley, protecting the sacks with oilcloth that smelled like fresh earth after rain, and rationing the surplus like a savvy Netflix subscription. Laughter and relief rippled through the hall, the tension dissolving into a chorus of relieved sighs, as the king declared Joseph his chief planner, sealing his fate with a ceremonial scarab-shaped amulet. Pharaoh, impressed by Joseph's knack for turning chaos into order, stamps a scarlet seal on his new title, second in command of Egypt. Joseph strides through the granaries, the air thick with dust and the sweet, yeasty scent of stored wheat, his boots echoing on stone. He orders workers to map each silo, their chisels clinking like a jazz band in a desert tavern. The sun blazes through the high windows, turning the grain into a sea of gold that shimmers like a Netflix streaming queue, beautiful, endless, and somehow a little too much to swallow. By night, he watches the flood of numbers on papyrus, smiling at the thought that famine will soon have nowhere to hide. Soon the sky darkens, not with storm clouds but with the ominous rumble of empty stalls across the land. Word of the Egyptian pantry spreads like gossip at a family reunion, and the brothers, barefoot and gaunt, shuffle into the bustling market gates, clutching empty sacks as if they were prized souvenirs. The scent of roasted lentils and figs wafts from the palace kitchens, making their stomachs ache with both hunger and shame. They bow before a man whose eyes glitter like polished obsidian, never guessing that the dream weaver they once betrayed now holds the keys to their survival. Joseph watches them, his heart a drumbeat of conflict, his mind replaying the night of his coat of many colors like an old sitcom rerun. When the brothers finally stand before Joseph, tension crackles louder than the fire pits outside, each word a dagger wrapped in polite courtesy. Joseph drops the pretense, his voice low, "Do you love me?" A line that would make any reality show host blush, because the stakes are way higher than a rose ceremony. He tests their loyalty by demanding the youngest stay behind, a move that feels like he's playing chess with live chickens, yet it forces each brother to confront his guilt. As tears mix with sweat, the eldest throws himself at Joseph's feet, whispering apologies that smell of sand and regret, and Joseph's heart softens like butter left in the Nile heat. In that moment, forgiveness flows faster than the Nile flood, turning former prisoners into providers and proving that even a dream-tangled exile can become the ultimate family therapist. The palace doors swung open with a clang that echoed like a drum roll at a rock concert, and Joseph stepped into the dim corridor where his brothers huddled like nervous extras on a set. His beard, now trimmed to a neat pharaoh-style cut, caught the flicker of torchlight, and the scent of spiced lamb mingled with the stale air of stone. He raised a hand, and the brothers froze, their eyes widening as if they'd just seen the ghost of their favorite video game boss appear in real life. "It is I, Joseph," he declared, voice steady, the words rolling out louder than the babble of the Nile on a stormy night. A gasp broke the silence, then a chorus of bewildered whispers as the truth sank in, turning fear into a trembling kind of awe. Joseph pulled his brothers into an embrace that smelled of sweat, dust, and the faint perfume of myrrh from the royal chambers, and the moment stretched like taffy in the heat. Their hands, calloused from the fields, met his regal robes with a mixture of guilt and relief that tasted like bitter cumin. Laughter cracked through the tension, a nervous, almost comic chuckle that sounded like someone slipping on a banana peel in a desert bazaar. He ushered them to a banquet where figs burst juicy under their teeth, and the wine poured as freely as the river after a flood, sealing the reunion with shared plates and stories. In that revelry, the irony sang. The very brothers who once sold him into slavery now dined under the very roof he'd built for them. Later, as the sun set in a blaze of amber over the pyramids, Joseph stood on the balcony and watched his family scatter like a flock of starlit doves, each child's laugh echoing against stone walls. He recalled his teenage nightmares of grain-filled baskets and the cryptic visions of sun-wreathed sheaves, realizing they weren't just teenage drama, but a divine script he'd unknowingly star-acted in. The kingdom's famine dissolved under his wise administration, turning the desert's growl into a chorus of grateful murmurs, proof that his childhood daydreams had morphed into a full-blown blockbuster of providence. Even the court jester whispered that Joseph's life had the best plot twist since anyone's favorite superhero turned evil and then saved the world. In that moment, Joseph felt the weight of his cloak lift, replaced by a warm, invisible mantle of reconciliation, as if the universe itself had given him a high five.